All right. So I decided to do my presentation on the War on Terror. I chose this just because it's something I kind of grew up with, and so I kind of knew a little bit about it going into it. But because I was so young when a lot of this happened, I didn't know exactly all what went into it. Um, so the War on Terror, it kind of is not really technically a war per se. It's just like a term that, by definition, it's just the ongoing campaign by the United States and some of its allies to counter international terrorism. And so, what it means, it's not necessarily a war that you can take two countries and say they're fighting this against this for this specific reason, but it's more of a group of countries and their militaries just trying to combat terrorism wherever it may come from, depending on whether it's the US saying that it's coming from Iraq, Iran, North Korea, all these places. Um, so it's just all these different countries trying to combat terrorism. And it started more in around 2001. And the thing that originally like took off the war on terrorism and war on terror sort of spiel is President Bush and his administration and the speech that they gave after the September 11th terrorist attacks, and that kind of started the term war on terror. And because of that, um, is why people refer to it as the war on terror and the war on terrorism. So the September 11th attacks, it happened in 2001, and 19 Islamic militant terrorists hijacked four different U.S. airliners, and they're all different airlines. There is an American Airlines flight, there was a United flight, so it wasn't all just from the same airline, and it wasn't from the same place either. It actually happened from many different airlines. Most of the flights were coming from the East Coast and were headed to California, like San Francisco and places like that. And two of the planes that they hijacked hit the World Trade Center in New York City, and one of them hit the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., while the other tried to fly to Washington and it flew into a field in Pennsylvania. This was kind of, I remember this day just because I think I was 6 on September 11th, and I remember I was headed to school. I was actually in class, and they sent us all home, and we didn't know why or really what was going on because they didn't want to scare any of the kids, so they didn't want to tell us. But none of us knew why we would go home so early in the day because by the time we went home, it was only about 10 a.m. So school had just started a few hours earlier. And I didn't understand really the extent of how bad it was. And my mom told me that they shut Disney World down just so I could understand that things were really bad and things were serious. I actually don't, I think they did shut Disney World down, but I don't know for sure if they actually did. But that's how my brain understood what was going on. And then later in the day, I actually found out that my grandfather, he was on a flight to New York City at the time, which was a little bit of why it was kind of more scary for my family. And then my uncle, who lived in New Jersey at the time, he actually had a job working in the World Trade Center, and he decided to actually work from home that day. Um, so I guess fate was on his side. So the first sort of attack that happened was in New York City, and two separate planes went and hit New York City. Um, the first of which hit the North Tower, and that hit right before 9 a.m. So it's really early in the morning. And the second one followed about 20 minutes later, and that one hit the South Tower. So both of the towers were hit. I think this was probably taken right after 9 o'clock because you can see like the plane is coming in, and this was right after, this was the North Tower right after the first plane hit. And these both were, they both hijacked the planes from Boston. So they hijacked both these planes from Boston and they're headed to California, and then they turned them around and headed them straight to New York City. And within like 2 hours, both of the towers completely collapsed and was just ash. So this picture right here, this one is right after the second plane hit, and it was also, I'm pretty sure this one is when they started collapsing. And then this picture up here in the corner is as both of the towers kind of went down. And there's actually videos showing both of them just collapsing on top of each other. And the dust and everything was so bad. You can see all the dust here. The dust was so bad, it was covering blocks and blocks of people. And this is just kind of a picture of the cloud of dust from all the destruction. And a lot of the people in it, even in the building, they knew they weren't going to get out in the top of the building. And there's even some pictures where they're just kind of falling because they would rather just jump out of the building than burn up. And I didn't post them on my presentation, but you can definitely easily go see them. It's kind of terrifying looking at just how scared these people were. And so this day and this attack, nearly 3,000 people were killed. And then on top of that, there was 300 firefighters and rescue workers that were also killed because they were the people that were inside the building trying to get people out. And when it collapsed, they couldn't all get out of there in time. And the next flight that got hijacked, it was an American Airlines flight, and it came from the Dulles Airport, and it was hijacked, and they turned it around. It was headed towards California again, and it was a Boeing 757, and it was hijacked by 5 terrorists, and they turned this one to Washington, D.C., where they flew it right into the Pentagon, and it kind of hit. It's hard to tell in the photos, but it hit going almost directly inside the building. So it just completely took out this entire wing of the Pentagon, it destroyed the whole building, and it killed 189 military personnel and workers. So this one kind of was a little bit less of an impact, just because there was less people that were affected by it. It was all just military mainly. But this one happened a couple hours after the New York ones happened because this all happened on the same day. And so this one was terrifying just because it was in Washington, D.C., and it was at a place where you'd think was safe from things like that. So yeah, it took out a whole wing. So these are just a couple pictures. This is the rebuilding of the wing itself, which I'm pretty sure probably is done being rebuilt by now. But these are a couple pictures of right when it first happened. You can't really tell the plane because it literally went inside the building and it flew through the windows inside of the building. And then the last plane that got hijacked was a United Airline flight, and that one was headed out of New Jersey, and they were actually going to San Francisco as well. And they got turned around, and they tried hijacking the plane, and they did get kind of control of over the plane, but the passengers actually tried to fight back to regain control, which is why it crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. A lot of people say that it was actually headed towards Washington because they were attempting to turn towards Washington, D.C. And if they did, that most likely it would have probably crashed either into the White House or crashed into Congress. Just another big area with a lot of people that would have made a really big impact, especially an area with a lot of military personnel in it. But because the passengers kind of took control of everything and took over, they luckily just landed in a field away from other civilians. However, all the passengers and the flight attendants did die in it, and I think it was 44 people altogether died in the crash. But they kind of saved a lot of lives because one, it just crashed into a field, so no other outside people got hurt because of that, and then they also prevented it from getting all the way to Washington, D.C. And so after these four attacks is kind of how the term war on terror kind of started. Um, so I have a picture later in the presentation, but President Bush wasn't even in Washington, D.C. He was actually in Florida, I think he was in Saratoga, Florida. He was reading to a group of elementary school students at the time of the first plane crash, and so he was there for the first hour or so of the attacks. And there's a picture that I have where you can just see his face, and he's reading to a bunch of elementary school students, so you can't really exactly say, you can't have like a facial description that kind of describes to these kids what's going on because you don't want to terrify them. And so he couldn't really do anything about it until after he was done reading because he didn't want to scare these kids. And he actually gave the first address to the nation at the school. And then after that, he left from there to go to different military bases. I think he ended up going to a base in Louisiana after that. And I don't know if might have been the speech either that day or the day after. That's when they first used the term war on terror to kind of describe exactly what was going on. And they use that in multiple speeches to kind of, in a way, add fear that was already there in the eyes of many Americans. And so then the reason behind all this is because of Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. It was they kind of took credit for it a few days after the attacks through videos. And so we know exactly who did it all.